first panel discussion. And as this is a hybrid conference, this will be a hybrid panel. Before I introduce our panelists and invite the one in person to come and join me on stage, let me give you a brief overview, because it is rather a complicated topic. As you know, this session is called Bumps in the Road, Tackling the Supply Chain Challenges Facing the Transport Sector. At a time when Europe's transport sector is undergoing a transformation in terms of sustainability and digitalization, the global pandemic has exposed Europe's reliance on global supply chains for raw materials and components such as semiconductors, essential in the production of modern vehicles. The combination of COVID-19 and high demand for these chips meant the disruption to the European auto sector included the shuttering of production plants and thousands of job losses. Welcome, David. As part of its ambitions for increased European strategic autonomy, the European Commission has recently released the EU Chips Act, which includes the repositioning of its role in the production of semiconductors. In this context, this session will look at the necessary considerations relevant for the auto and indeed transport sector more broadly. Can Europe source the materials necessary to deliver on the electrification of the transport system, and how can it develop and utilize materials that have a reduced social and environmental impact? And as demand for electric car vehicles continue to rise, so has demand for e-vehicle batteries. Europe has started to build up its capacity to reproduce batteries on the continent, while also developing a new generation of batteries that are less dependent on the lithium-ion technology. Our panel this morning will discuss what is being done to boost the production of these e-vehicle batteries, including the supply of less polluting raw materials in Europe in order to reduce its external dependencies. And as the global economic and health outlook continues to present significant uncertainties in the drive for a green and sustainable transport future, how can Europe's auto sector answer the main challenges it faces? There you are. The scene has now been set. I'd like to welcome, first of all, in order of their speaking positions on the panel, virtually Philippe Negriano-Aboriano, who is a Deputy Head of Cabinet for Commissioner Aldina Vallillon, the Commissioner for Transport. Welcome, Philippe. Thank you for being with us. Dr. Patrick Schroeder, who is a Senior Research Fellow, Environment Society Programme at Chatham House in London. Good morning, Patrick. Excellent, you're there. With me, physically keeping me company on stage, David Archer, CEO of Savannah Resources. Welcome, David.
Thank you.
And last but not least, Petra Doleshti. I'm sure I mispronounced your last name, Peter, forgive me. Director Mobility and Sustainable Transport at ASEA. So we're going to kick off in this order of presentation, and I'm going to invite Philippe, first of all, to give us your opening remarks. Over to you, Philippe.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much for choosing such an important topic. I hope you can hear me well. The supply chain disruptions and sourcing of materials that we need for our new technologies that we're trying to deploy in order to reach our decarbonization targets have been present with us for at least 1 year. It's kind of obvious to say that supply chain disruptions were first caused by the pandemic, which disrupted our normal way of moving goods around the world. And of course, there are subsequent or additional challenges in what regards the smooth production of our components that need to be shipped around the world in those areas where we have localized our main production capacities. From a transport perspective, the supply chain disruptions are clearly a need that we need to are clearly a problem that we need to overcome. And even if our sustainable and smart mobility strategy that we have proposed at the European Commission ahead of the COVID-19 pandemic, we quickly realized that during the preparation work for this strategy, we needed to increase the resilience of the transport sector. Now, transport functions right now in a global way with different modes that are essential, all of them, to move around persons and goods. They're also essential to enable services and globalized services around the world, since people need to travel to be able to provide these services. That is why in the Sustainable and Smart Mobility Strategy, we chose to embed resilience in each and every proposal that we have showcased under our 10 flagships and over 90 sector-specific proposals that will be defining our policy throughout these years. And we have countless examples of how important it is to maintain and boost, for example, the intermodality of the transport sector. Because if supply chain disruptions occur in one area or one sector, the system as a whole needs to be able to quickly adapt and move the flows from the targeted area or sector to other ones that should be able to substitute what is not functioning very quickly and usually without preparation. Transitioning from the COVID pandemic, where we've seen how heavy the long-term impacts has been, for example, on aviation, which is still 30 or 35% down compared to pre-pandemic levels. When we have seen during the pandemic how easy it is to block everything if border measures or sanitary measures are not coordinated, and if transport workers are not exempted from quarantine and border measures in order to be able to continue doing their jobs. Now, all of that has been solved via hard work by all stakeholders, but also hard work in coordinating at EU level what member states envisage to do, just to be able to keep the wheels turning and the trucks and trains going across borders, even during the severe lockdowns. Now, transitioning from all of that into a recovery phase, which is, of course, boosted by huge investments, which we have made available for multimodality, for sustainability enhancement in all transport modes, for infrastructure, with the Connecting Europe facility, where, for example, we have 1.5 billion just for more recharging stations. Transitioning and adding on top the huge amount of investment in the Recovery and Resilience Facility gave some kind of an outlook for an accelerated recovery in terms of both infrastructure and services, but also an accelerated drive towards sustainability. All of this increases the resilience of supply chains. But history is sometimes cruel. While the recovery was picking up, we are now faced with a new crisis, with a crisis which has a human decision at its core. It's not created by nature. It's not a climate crisis. It's not a health crisis. It's simply a war, an aggression that changes the way transport works, at least in parts of Europe. Again, during this crisis, which is still ongoing, we should be able, and we are able, to use the lessons learned in the pandemic to make sure that transport flows continue. Actually, this war also shows that transport is essential in any situation, regardless how hard the situation is, because regardless of the degree of the aggression, the violence, the bombings, transport still needs to function. Humanitarian aid needs to flow into Ukraine, and refugees need to be transferred outside of Ukraine and distributed among member states. Now, at the Commission level, we have rapidly activated the coordination mechanisms that were set up for the COVID crisis, and now we're able to match demands by frontline member states with the offers of stakeholders in the transport sector, the private sector, but also with offers by other member states ready to chip in and help. So what this crisis has shown again after the COVID crisis is that transport is key to maintain the economy working, And for transport, it is key to make it resilient. Of course, the subject we are focusing today, chips, raw materials, sourcing, uh, location of production, and supply chains towards the final markets. Uh, this is also impacted by what we're witnessing today. Um, that is why at the Commission we are now working on a contingency plan for the transport sector, which will create a framework that is easily to activate whenever a crisis strikes, and that identifies or pre-identifies measures and coordination mechanisms that can be activated in order to make sure that flows keep flowing regardless of the nature of a crisis, and regardless of the fact that we will never be able to foresee a crisis or prepare for a specific crisis in advance. Um, on more specifically on the chips, it's quite clear from the Chips Act that the Commission has taken important steps in preparing Europe for its strategic independence on chips manufacturing and on creating an ecosystem for that. Oh, we were among the first ones to be asked for help, and we offered immediately that help. Part of the CHIPS initiative is being financed with funds that are stemming from the Connecting Europe facility. Um, and we will keep doing that and keep facilitating growth within the transport sector and for the transport ecosystem, because what we need to maintain besides a resilient transport operation is to maintain a resilient industrial ecosystem for transport. And this is another key takeaway from all these crises. We need to make sure that all modes are developed and keep growing and keep enhancing connectivity to be able to make those supply chains more modern and more resilient. And when I say that as a part of our Green Deal strategy to change the industrial growth in the transport sector by making it more sustainable. Now, of course, the energy prices have a huge impact on how transport sees its sustainability quest. But nevertheless, since the energy sector and the transport sector are in some kind of a competition for the same scarce resources, which are represented by clean energy sources, we need to make sure that the choices that the transport sector makes are safe in terms of supply for new fuels, for new infrastructure, and to make sure that the basket of measures for sustainable alternative fuels and the sources of those fuels are kept flexible and open, just to make sure that we don't end up in a scenario where we depend on the needs of other sectors to be able to supply the transport sector with the fuel it needs. So here, this crisis and our strategy also maintains a technology neutral approach, where we see a place for each and every fuel except for the most polluting ones, where we see global markets for alternative fuels being the key answer to the scarcity of clean alternatives in Europe because of the needs for the electricity sector. So we see a world where, to put it simply, where the oil tankers that transport oil today, or sometimes even Russian oil, can be used in the future to transport e-fuels created with the use of solar and wind in areas where this is a vast resource. And embedding e-fuels in our energy mix will then also mean that we can have a huge advantage of scale by being able to use the existing infrastructure that we have. So in a nutshell, to sum up, I would say that resilience, change, sustainability, and flexible alternatives are what we need to make sure that from a transport perspective, the supply chains are maintained and extended, and that we have access to the raw materials, chips, and services that we need to drive our decarbonization and market agenda further. Of course, I'm open to receive questions, and thank you for allowing me to present today.
Thank you very much, Philip. But I certainly have many questions for you, but I'll wait till we've heard from all our panel and also invite the audience, obviously, to pose questions to you, like to all the panelists. So if you bear with us, Philip, we'll move on to our next speaker. Patrick, over to you. Let's hear your opening remarks, please.
Yes, good morning. I hope you can hear me okay. Thank you for inviting me to join the panel today. My name is Patrick Schroeder. I'm a senior research fellow at Chatham House, where I lead the research on circular economy. And earlier this year, we've tried thinking through the potentials if a circular economy approach can be useful to address the semiconductor supply shortages, and which has, as was mentioned, and as probably everyone is well aware of, has impacted the automotive industry quite heavily. Some of the data I saw was that about $200 billion were lost in revenues just in 2021, and the shortage is quite relevant also for the transition to a net zero transport system, especially when it comes to EVs. So the average electric vehicle needs about 2,000 chips, and that's about double the number of semiconductors that's needed for a non-electric car. And as we know, as was mentioned also, as a solution to this and to reduce the reliance on semiconductor manufacturing, which is mainly concentrated in Taiwan and Korea, so the EU and member states announced the European Chips Act, and then subsequently mobilized billions to invest in new manufacturing facilities in Europe. And the aim, as you will know, is to double the share of global microchips production to about 20%. And so that was the situation before the Russian invasion, the war in Ukraine, which has now actually put new potential impacts on supply chains for semiconductors. So there might be additional disruptions coming. One reason is that Ukraine provides about half the world's supply of neon, which is a gas that's needed for high precision laser equipment that is then in turn used to manufacture microchips. Then Russia supplies about 25 to 30% of the world's palladium, also a metal that's used by car manufacturers for exhaust systems, and it's also used in semiconductors. We've also seen that nickel markets have been severely disrupted, which is nickel being used in stainless steel for electric vehicle batteries. The price skyrocketed, and it was actually that caused the London Metal Exchange to stop trading for about a week. So although what we've seen, even if we bring manufacturing to Europe with the CHIPS Act, so if we have these other further upstream supply chain issues, so this is now potentially really becoming a choke point for the clean energy transition and decarbonized transport systems. And it also can hamper efforts of European countries to reduce their energy dependence on Russia. So, and I mean, even if the war ends soon, and hopefully it will, it's quite unlikely that supply chains will go back to normal. And now this is where we try to bring in the circular economy thinking, because the circular economy is very much about changing the way supply chains or value chains have operated. And it's a shift more from single value chains to something called value networks, to, as also mentioned, not only to address environmental issues, but also to bring in more resilience into those various industries and value networks. So one area that we think could be useful to in the semiconductor context now is to align the European Chips Act more closely with the push in the EU towards the EU Green Deal and the Circular Economy Action Plan and other parallel policy developments that are taking place, such as the Circular Electronics Initiative. And that's maybe also an opportunity to turn a crisis into an advantage. So as Europe is now building up manufacturing, maybe aligning that with circularity principles could lead to a new innovation in semiconductors by embedding those principles into semiconductor design. And how it links to electronics, there's already a number of very good initiatives going on towards the push for design for repair and extending lifetimes of devices. And maybe for the automotive industry, there's an opportunity really to start creating transparent and reliable secondary markets for reused electronics and microchips that are used in EVs especially. And then just to finish my remarks, but when we need also to think more broadly about sustainable mobility systems. So the circular economy is not only about reusing of components and recycling of materials from batteries or used vehicles, but it's, as also was mentioned before, it's really about a multimodal mobility structure that incorporates public transportation in combination with on-demand cars as flexible last mile solutions. But it's also circularity principles also being extended to urban design. So we do need to reconsider our car-centric designs of cities and create cities where active mobility practices such as walking and cycling is possible to really achieve net zero targets in the transport sector. Okay, I'll stop here. Happy to answer any questions and engage further in the discussions.
Right. Yes, thank you very much, Patrick. Again, many questions for you, but we'll wait till the end of the panel and we'll come back to you for the Q&A bit. Now turn to David, my friend here on stage. Over to you. I hope you tell us also something about the company that you lead. David, over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Paul, and very good to be presenting here this morning in Brussels. I will take the opportunity to introduce myself. My name is David Archer. I'm the CEO of Savannah Resources, which is headquartered in London, and we're developing the Barosso lithium project in northern Portugal. This is actually Europe's largest conventional lithium development. And we believe that it will be ideally located to provide lithium for Europe's fast-growing lithium battery value chain. We're talking about transport. Lithium and metals like it, nickel, will be extremely important in terms of being enablers for renewables. That's both really in storage and, in our case, transportation. It's an enabler. It means that renewables from wind, hydro or solar can effectively be employed in transportation. So it's that sort of critical bridge, I suppose, that enables electric mobility. So that's really the significance of it all. I might just put a slide up, and I think it has to be also sort of seen in a global context. At the moment, I think these critical raw materials really do have a geostrategic and geoeconomic significance. The major producing regions of the world actually happen to be in the global south, in South America, and from the country in which I was born, Australia. Interestingly enough, the sort of major refining centre globally is in China and broadly in East Asia. But the major centres of consumption are really China and Europe, and really in North America itself. China looks like it will be sort of the major consumer, if you're not producer, of electric vehicles by 2030. Europe will probably be in second place. And I think that sort of really sort of illustrates the importance of Europe, I suppose, sort of transforming itself from not only being a major consuming region, but to be a major refining region and a major consuming region of, if you like, electric vehicles and these sort of key strategic minerals. And of course, you know, this very much sort of plays to the European Commission's actually very sort of far-seeing policy initiatives, which date from as early as 2016, 2017, with the incorporation of the European Battery Alliance. And Europe has, I suppose, been sort of talking politely about strategic autonomy. But I think Europe, having been visited by yet another horseman of the apocalypse in the last few weeks, has really only sort of underscored the good sense of that, and really means that, you know, we really should, we as in Europeans, the European Commission, governments of the member states, really have to look to accelerate the initiatives underway at the moment to sort of build resilience in terms of, you know, particularly sort of the build out of renewable power generation. I think that's an extraordinarily important strategic initiative for Europe. I think it advantages Europe. I think it will provide more independence for Europe. I think it will advantage European products, particularly electric vehicles. I think consumers will be looking for products that are responsibly developed, contain raw material inputs that sort of come from appropriate jurisdictions. In our case, sort of clearly with our project in Portugal, you know, we believe it is a very appropriate raw material input for European manufacturers. The raw material itself will be sort of produced in strict accordance with both European and Portuguese environmental legislation and regulations. Sort of clearly, labour regulations in Europe are tier one, sort of removes any issues around inappropriate labour relationships. And of course, you know, Portugal is a member country of the European Union, and of course enjoys, you know, first-class sort of governance frameworks and structures. And in our case, for example, you know, we're really looking to very much match those requirements. We're listed on the London Stock Exchange. We work to sort of a tight set of adopted governance principles. And what we're really looking at doing is producing raw material which is sort of very consistent with the sustainability goals of the European Commission and the European Union. We're making a very big initiative in terms of the decarbonisation of our project, and we believe that our project, you know, could be the example of, I suppose, first application of the use of electrically powered mining equipment in Europe. And you know, we'd really like to be sort of the showcase for European innovation in terms of this important sector. One of our key objectives is to actually make this project carbon neutral, not at a point in the future. What we wish to build is a project which actually is carbon neutral life of mine. And I think that certainly will be a stretch target. We believe it's achievable, but I think that's going to be the requirement for not only new mines, but I think it will be the requirement for projects that are developed in other industries as well. It's no good continuing to sort of pump out carbon in the early years of a project and really not making up for that in the latter years of a project. I think one of the other sort of the key elements to, you know, particularly what we're doing is sort of looking at the social implications of the energy transition. We're part of that transition. We're very sort of conscious of the social and environmental impacts. In our case, we've designed a development in which there are something like 238 individual initiatives to either eliminate or mitigate environmental impacts. I'm quick to say that resource production has a physical manifestation. There is no getting away from that. This is material. It's not produced by the gods or by the fairies. It is a physical enterprise. But there are things that we can do to minimise or eliminate the impacts, and we're very conscious of that, including the decarbonisation strategy that we have. But we're also looking to communities where we've got a series of initiatives that are specifically designed to sort of benefit communities, a benefit sharing plan in which we'll form a foundation that will be endowed with money from the profits of our operation, and that money will then be used and to go into community initiatives, and the community will be the sort of leaders in terms of deciding what are the best projects that can go into. We're looking at quite an innovative program around developing community-owned service provision companies. We want to ensure that the community will enjoy long-term benefits long after our project goes out of production. So we would like to sort of have a long-term sort of benefit for those local communities. I won't say very much more, but certainly I think Ukraine has really sort of presented and underscored the nature of the problem a little bit like what I describe as Russian nesting dolls. I mean, there are so many elements associated with the energy transition. Clearly it's all about fighting global climate change. In our case, we'll be eliminating something like 100 million tonnes of CO2 from the atmosphere in terms of the EVs that will be powered by our lithium. That's something equivalent to something like 36% of France's CO2 emissions in 2020. It goes to geoeconomics. It goes to the comparative industrial advantage of European countries. It goes to social impacts. It goes to indeed the balancing of positions of narrow sectional interests, and I think it also goes to the health of Europeans as well. I think one factor that is oftentimes forgotten in the move to decarbonisation is the introduction of electric mobility. Will have a transformational impact on the quality of life for Europeans in cities and towns, both in terms of noise, but particularly in terms of particulate emissions, and having 2 grandchildren and 2 further grandchildren on the way, very conscious of the health impacts of particulate emissions on the health of children. So on that note, I'd like to conclude and thank you for the opportunity of presenting.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David. Again, many questions, but I'll wait and be patient. And talking about questions, I see from my trusty tablet that we're already getting questions online. So prepare yourselves also here in the room to put questions to the panel after our last speaker, who is Peter. Peter, you've been very patient. And now I turn to you for your opening remarks. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much. And I hope you hear me well. Of course, not easy always to be the last on the panel. So I will try to let me just highlight a few of the points that were mentioned and that are critical for our sector. I represent ASEA, European Car Manufacturers Association, and I'm in charge of the sustainable transport. The first point that was mentioned here, I think that both crisis, COVID, and now Russia-Ukraine show how complex the whole supply and value chain is. And in principle, we took that as granted, that everything is working smoothly. And suddenly we had a closure of the borders in Europe. I have to say that for my kids, they have seen that for the first time in their life, which was really surprising. And suddenly from day to day, we completely stopped the transportation. Then we have seen a small accident in Suez, which completely shaked the global transportation and the delivery of goods in Europe. And of course, without comments now, going to Ukraine and showing that really the value chain is huge. It's enormously vulnerable. And of course, we need to, let's say, see that from a little bit global perspective. I liked one slide that was already here in the first introductory remarks. It shows that I think it is not only about the CHIPS Act or any particular piece of legislation. This is really about integrated approach. This is really about a number of policy measures that really need to, let's say, change what David nicely showed in his slides. We are one of the biggest consumers, but we don't produce the things, and this is probably wrong. And we need to reflect to change that into really strategic independency of Europe and production. So from that angle, I think that we need to have a look on industrial policy that was very often forgotten, but really without supportive measures to reinstall the industrial base, we cannot move ahead, and we cannot help to protect our welfare and our production here. This also means that, as I mentioned, this is not only about the CHIPS Act. It's just one small piece that, of course, it has huge implications. We started with the batteries. This is another element. But what will be else? If you have a look on a conventional car, we are talking roughly about 5,000 different components. And all of that, or vast majority, is, of course, imported from the third parties. So we can think about what might be the next critical point. Neon was mentioned here, lasers, maybe solar panels that we are importing mostly from China, etc. So really, all that needs to be revisited, and we need to work on that. What is also important for us is the timing, because maybe David is better placed than me, but talking to his competitors and opening or just getting permissions for starting new mining sites, they were lucky. Just took them 13 years, one fee, okay? And they haven't started yet. So, of course, this also shows how complex the issue is. And I'm afraid that we are having nice wishes with respect to 2030, but in reality, it will probably take a longer time. And I'm saying that also with respect to the, let's say, a very complex perspective on the whole legislative act, because really we need to ensure that what we are requiring in one is feasible from the perspective of the other. And we show these discrepancies already within the Fit for 55 package, which of course was nicely drafted by the Commission and really big compliments. But on the other hand, we already see now that when you go into negotiations, you have different perspectives, and definitely it will not be such a coherent package. And that would be applicable also to the question how to, let's say, reinstall the supply and value chain in Europe, because it will take time. It will take time for permitting, for construction, and really we need to be sure that all the policy incentives and measures will really fit together. We have mentioned here circular economy. All that is not a question of a couple of days, and it must be some kind of a coherent approach to that. And with that, I will leave it here, and of course, happy to reply to possible questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. Okay, right. We're going to start a panel discussion now. Before I invite the audience here in the room and online to pitch in with their question, I want to ask a couple of questions of the panel. First of all, for my own maybe clarification, something you mentioned, first of all, obviously, Philippe, this issue of resilience. I'm not going to ask you maybe to define what resilience means in this context, but how do we know, what are the targets? How do we know when the EU is approaching or has reached resilience? Because it's a word which is bandied about a lot. It's like sustainability. But what do we actually mean in practice when we say the EU has to be more resilient? Philippe.
Thank you for the question. It's I'll try to give two examples to show what resilience means from a Commission action perspective. During the pandemic, we were confronted with the blockades on all transport modes, but we were also confronted with the fact that because of the health measures, operators could not function in the boundaries of the existing operation rules for transport. In aviation, it's been largely discussed, it's still present in the press, the slots rule, which obliges airlines to fly 80% of their flights to maintain the slots that they have negotiated with airports. Now, during the pandemic, the Commission has came up with successive with an initial amending proposal to lift the 80/20 rule and to give certain flexibilities. The member states have accepted that, and this has been going on until today with a modulation of these percentages and with the use of a specific clause for emergency situations where you can even go beyond the percentages that have been established during the pandemic for each season in aviation. So this is one example where resilience means flexibility and being able to adapt immediately to a situation that occurs, which goes beyond the framework where operators can change what they're doing. In another domain, we had the truck drivers who were stuck at borders for testing, for border checks, for vaccination certificates. This had a huge impact on their requirement to remain inside a very technical and complex framework for driving and rest times. So what we did was to create a framework where member states could lift temporarily these driving and rest times while maintaining road safety, of course, in order to keep the trucks going even in conditions where some member states decided to check everybody for tests or for vaccination. So these are two examples where regulatory resilience is needed or regulatory flexibility is needed in order to make sure that whenever something occurs, you're able to act in a moment to make sure things go on. Now, let's take the current crisis with the war. Let's imagine a scenario where gas deliveries to Europe from Russia are stopped by one side or the other. I'm not going to explore the options there. What happens if in a future where all transport is based on one fuel only, be it electric, hydrogen, e-fuels, biofuels? So if there's not enough flexibility embedded in the supply chain for fuels, for example, we risk having a situation where a major disruption for one fuel determines a huge supply chain crisis or a stop of transport. So this is why the Fit for 55, I saw my predecessors mentioning it, in the part that comes from us, from the transport part of the Commission, we are just proposing technology neutral developments for infrastructure, for electricity charging, for hydrogen charging, for alternative fuels blending in aviation, for all kinds of fuels that can reduce the carbon intensity in maritime. So there you go. And we even maintain targets that follow market developments on the road sector for gas and LNG. So there you have it. We already tried to factor in, because COVID was already happening, this kind of technology neutrality as a way to maintain flexibility and resilience, to make sure that whatever happens to a source of fuel or to a source of disruption in regulation, we are able to contain it and to maintain the transport flows. So here you go. I hope the three examples provide some clarity on how we see this resilience embedded into the transport system.
Thank you, Philip. Really, really useful to hear that. Thank you very much. I'd like to turn to Patrick briefly, because one of the comments you made was the opportunity, even in these dire circumstances, of making sure that if I'm not misquoting you, the EU Chips Act works more in sort of in coherence with the new Green Deal and the circular economy initiative. Could you maybe, you didn't have much time in your opening remarks, could you develop that thought, please, so we can see what is your thesis, how these three different initiatives could be more coherently working together?
Yes, yeah, thanks for the questions. And I mean, overall, from my perspective, we see actually the European Green Deal as kind of the center of future European industrial development, and also linked to the other large-scale challenges that we're facing in terms of climate disruption and environmental crisis. So and then as part of the European Green Deal, obviously the Circular Economy Action Plan is one of the key elements. And so the European Chips Act, for instance, has not yet been, as far as I can tell, hasn't been directly connected to these larger and more long-term trends. So that's what I wanted to highlight as the opportunity to do this, because, for instance, just looking at the European Chips Act, it doesn't seem, well, it's about boosting manufacturing capacity, which is obviously important, also in terms of building resilience and providing stable supply. But there's, I think, a few things that a circular economy approach can bring in addition. And when we look at semiconductors, for example, I think it's directly linked to the issues around sustainable use of electronics. There's a number of practices and approaches that are now being applied. For instance, I mean, it's linked not only to tackling global e-waste crisis, but it's also linked to issues around, again, critical metals, etc. So we see there's shifts towards right to repair movements. There's what's happening in the EU is also the Sustainable Products Initiative, which is looking at new design criteria for many products. When it comes to electronics, obviously these are then relevant also for the automotive industry. And what we also see are investments into new e-waste recycling facilities in Europe. Just there was in Wales a recent announcement these last few days, new investments to recover critical materials from e-waste that's going to be collected locally. So these are all trends which are happening, and I think if we connect them in a smarter way on policy level, we can build in overall resilience into the system.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. I have a couple of from online, a couple of lithium related questions. So I'll address them in the first instance to David on my left, but obviously anybody in the panel can chip in afterwards, and then afterwards I'll turn to the audience here in the room. The first question is from a gentleman called Bernard Moore. He doesn't give his affiliation. If you want to write in again, Bernard, and tell us what your affiliation is, you're very welcome. Your question is as follows. Europe effectively produces 0% of its own lithium, David, says Bernard. At the same time, announcements of new battery gigafactories are weekly, if not daily. What more could the EU do to encourage member states to start mining their resources and get through the local licensing hurdles faced by mining companies such as Savannah? And the second question, so take note, David, from Stefano Proietti, who's a senior researcher at ISI Nova. And his question is as follows. Lithium is often considered as the new white gold in comparison to the well-known black gold. When shaping new scenarios where lithium and other strategic materials will play an important role, is it possible to consider the different side effects to avoid all negative impact, environmental, social, political, military, we experience with the oil economy in the last 100 years? So tackle those questions as you wish, David.
Okay. All right. Just in terms of how I suppose the European Commission can sort of help to, I suppose, accelerate production in Europe. I think one of the sort of the key factors has been the relatively slow sort of licensing regimes that mineral producers have to face. I think that's not an experience which is unique to Europe. I think it really is something of a global phenomenon. But I think there's obviously sort of a key requirement to have real rigour around environmental licensing. I think member states want to see responsible production of the materials. I think that having a need for speed is not necessarily inconsistent with first-class sort of licensing practices on the part of regulators. So I would encourage a need for speed. I think as well that one of the challenges, of course, is that there have been very few modern mine developments that have been licensed or very a small number that have been licensed in Europe over the last few decades. So I think there's probably a need to sort of bring in external expertise into and make that available to governments to sort of accelerate the evaluation process, to accelerate the licensing process itself. I think there was also a need for more real funding to be directed, particularly at the upstream end of the lithium value chain. There's been an enormous amount of investment at the downstream end in terms of retooling of vehicle manufacturers to deal with electric vehicles. Everyone is aware of the extraordinary build out of gigafactories here in Europe to produce lithium-ion batteries, but there hasn't been sort of really a matching sort of build out of processing industries to process the lithium raw materials, or indeed mining itself. So I think the European Commission could certainly look at how it might be able to encourage that, particularly around grants. Australia, for example, just allocated 243 million Australian dollars in straight grants to encourage the development of processing industry in Australia. Insofar as I am aware, there's been very little to nil grants actually delivered to the mining industry here in Europe or to processing itself. So I see that there have been a number of initiatives announced by the Biden administration on the 22nd of February, and very much focused on directing sort of capital and grants to the North American industry. So I think that is something that could be replicated here in Europe. Just in terms of the second question, in terms of how we, I suppose, sort of build social license and community buy-in. I think what we've really tried to do is sort of build a project that really meets really very much best practice internationally in terms of the way the project is actually sort of framed up. But I think one of the things that we can do is really sort of talk about mineral production and talk about it a little bit more openly. I think the mineral production industry has perhaps not been its best advocate, and I'll certainly be talking to some groups here in Brussels today about how we as an industry can get out there and talk about what we can do and what the opportunities are. I'm sort of rather minded by ancient history. I think one of the sort of major sources of wealth for Rome was actually the development of resources in the Iberian Peninsula. The Iberian Peninsula was a very sort of popular or in-demand governorate for Roman generals. So I think there's an equivalent opportunity here. And finally, I think Europe really should look to maximise the benefits from its resources endowment. I think exploration should be encouraged in Europe. I think we've really only sort of touched the surface in terms of the mineral potential of the country, and I think a more favourable sort of licensing environment, I think, would encourage industry investment in exploration to sort of increase the overall published resource endowment of Europe.
Thank you, David. Anybody on the panel like to respond to those questions on lithium before I move on? Now's your opportunity. Anybody at all? No? Okay. In that, I'm going to turn to the people in the room, see if anybody here would like to ask a question. This gentleman here, those of you sort of hiding over there, make sure you wave your hands very obviously, because you're almost invisible to my peripheral vision. Give your name. I know who you are because you said hi at the beginning, but your name and your organization.
My name is Henk Zwartouw. I'm president of the European Cyclist Federation here in Brussels. Is there a camera I should speak to? No, eh?
We can see you, sir. You can see yourself.
Okay.
A side view.
Wonderful. Patrick Schroeder referred to it a couple of times. And with the present disruptions to the supply chains, we all know that the rollout of the electrification of our vehicle fleet will be too slow to reach particularly our emissions objectives in 2030, 40, 50. More than 90% of cars being sold now is powered by fossil fuels, and those cars will remain on the roads for another 20 or 30 years. The transport sector is the only one which is not reducing its emissions yet. This was recognized at COP26 in Glasgow in the Transport Declaration, which stated that active mobility, walking, cycling, public transport have a contribution to make to reach those goals, particularly as 50% of car trips in Europe presently is still shorter than 5 kilometers. So that's why I would very much welcome indeed Patrick's comments that active mobility, cycling, walking, public transport be included in the future of transport. So I'm looking forward to the further discussion at this conference on.
Thank you very much. We'll take that more as a comment than a question, but I just wonder whether Peter, on behalf of the Car Industry Association, would like to engage in this exchange with the Cycle Federation. Peter, what do you think, what you just heard?
Well, I think that this is not too much about the discussion between the two associations, but this is a personal attitude. I think that's the responsibility of all of us, how to choose the mode of transport, and of course from the policymakers to disincentivize the abuse of certain modes of transport or cycling or walking. That's clear. For me, maybe something in between that is very often forgotten. That's the role of the public transport, and this is something that definitely we see a huge room for clean mobility within the cities and towns. And okay, we all know being in Brussels, this is probably not the best example, but really there we see a huge gain for the future, which can bring a very quick and good solutions for our citizens.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Anybody else in the audience? Right, sorry, yes, you, Eric, and then the gentleman behind you, because I saw him first. Please give your name, Eric, even though I know who you are.
Yeah, Erik Jan Aert, now with Fipra Consultants. We talked a lot about lithium as an important raw material for batteries right now and in the near future. But there are a whole range, of course, of critical raw materials when we talk about the move to battery electric vehicles. We talk about cadmium, we talk about nickel. There are a lot of good initiatives underway, like the one described and presented by Savannah. However, given the deadlines which are there, and they were mentioned, in order to deliver zero-emission vehicles, and they are behind the door, as it were, we need this access to these strategically relevant raw materials for batteries now. And we heard about where these are right now in South Asia and in Latin America. So the question is in fact addressed to the Commission. What is the Commission doing to ensure that easy access can be ensured to manufacturers to this strategically relevant raw materials for batteries? Not in 5 or 10 years, but now. So what are the strategic, because this requires obviously also a trade dimension. So what are we doing? What are the negotiations going on with those countries where we could source those raw materials from?
Thank you, Eric. I'm sure you all know that for many years, Eric was the boss of ASEA, so I think he knows what he's talking about. I think the question was certainly directed to you, Philippe, but also I suspect David may want to intervene as well. Philippe, you go first. How do you respond to Eric's question?
Thank you, Eric, for the question. Of course, this is a question that is addressed to the Commission at large, but that can be replied to by the trade colleagues. Of course, facilitating access to these raw materials is key, and what we actually need is to enhance the link between our internal EU policies and our foreign policies and trade policies in order to make sure that the ambition level that we set for our economy inside the EU is matched by initiatives to, as you rightly pointed out, secure access to the materials and raw materials we need to accomplish those goals. And what we see now is exactly this disruption in access for our raw materials for batteries. That is why I was raising earlier the solution of maintaining the mix of clean fuels that would enable us to maintain a strategic independence from any of the fuels, be it electricity / batteries, reducing fossil fuels more and more, and substituting the fossil fuels with a broader range of alternatives. Thank you.
Thank you, Philippe. David?
Yeah, I think the question is a very important one, and just talking from an industry point of view, it's been fascinating for me, having been involved in the industry now for about 4 or 5 years, to really sort of see extreme interest, shall we say, from the European OEMs around what we're doing and the availability of raw materials. It used to be that we would call them 3 or 4 years ago, and the answer was, don't worry, we'll call you when we're ready. And it's not like that now. It's them calling us, and I think that sort of illustrates the point. There is an urgent, present need for these materials, and the urgency, I think, also should be sort of framed up around the urgency of the European car manufacturers to start producing at volume, and sort of clearly, producing at volume means you've got to have the raw materials. Why is it important to produce at volume? Because we want to sort of bring the capital cost of EVs down. We want to make EVs and sort of electric mobility devices as cheap as possible. I mean, they're a bit expensive at the moment, and it's the European consumers are otherwise faced with an extreme dilemma. They're either faced with the dilemma of sticking with internal combustion engine vehicles, which are fueled by very high-priced hydrocarbons, or have to pay quite high prices for electric vehicles. So somehow or other that problem, that wicked problem, has to be solved, and it's all about urgency. And I think the European Commission just really has to sort of crack the whip on a lot of these things that is announced, but make sure that these things do happen fast.
Peter or Patrick, would you like to come in before I move to the next question? Either of you? No? Yes? No? No.
Well, maybe shortly on that, of course, we're more than happy to do that and sell it in huge quantities. But of course, we all know that the issue is, of course, that someone has to buy it. And there, unfortunately, we see the limits. And okay, if we have a look what is happening around, it will be enormously difficult to convince the consumers to buy. So again, it will be about really a package of different policymakers, how to convince the consumers to move, and to my the buy and really move ahead, because yes, we are in a certain corner, I have to say.
Thank you. Patrick, yes, no? Before I move on, now's your chance.
Just a very brief, how to highlighting again the other side of the value chain. Can be maybe not a very short-term solution, but we should already start planning for it now to put in place urban mining solutions, including for lithium batteries, once they come at a large quantity. There's the need to have the facilities in place for recycling and recovering the lithium and other critical metals. So by doing this, we can shave off, in a way, some of the demand that we need from primary sourcing, also reducing the pressures that might emerge out of geopolitical changing circumstances, etc.
Okay, thank you. The gentleman over there, you have a microphone, sir, don't you? Yeah, right.
Yeah, thank you. Is it working? Yeah, Steve Phillips, Conference European Directors of Roads, representing the Road Administration. So maybe I can slightly broaden this discussion, because we've been fairly vehicular focused. Just a point of reference first. I mean, my members are facing huge challenges right now, because of the price of raw materials and the, asphalt and bitumen, steel, etc., huge increases in prices. Also, in some countries, a labour crisis, because a lot of the workers have unfortunately gone back to fight in their home country. So there's a big challenge there facing the sector. We're seeing companies go out of work. Now, these are the things that we need, whether it be for a cycleway, a road, or a railway. So many of the big infrastructure projects are getting a hit, as they did during COVID, because people couldn't move around. So I'm interested in the comments now about resilience and flexibility, and when we're talking about the transport system as a whole. So I think there's two things. One of which is, how do we balance that certainty with the flexibility that we heard is important for resilience? Because I think that they're two sides of the same coin. We hear that very often. So how do we balance those? How do we have the certainty that we know going forward to invest in these things? So as I say, if road authorities are facing challenges just to maintain the roads now, and on top of that we have to electrify the road, we also have to make it connected, and we can't get the chips for the roadside units. We have to have a clear roadmap of when we should be doing these things. We need to have the backup plans to know what might slip, both from the industry, both from the Commission. And at the moment, what we see is a series of different packages. We try to understand what the automotive sector is doing, but they are governed in a very different way. And so, that's my main point to Philip, and I guess also to Peter, is how do we balance that flexibility and certainty in the system?
Thank you very much. Who would like to respond to the issue of flexibility and certainty? Anybody in the panel want to chip in? Or you just take it as a comment? I think what he was asking about how do you balance certainty and flexibility. Philip, do you have any brief comments before I move on from the European Commission perspective?
Yes, thank you. Well, certainty is balanced by giving the outlook for investments. And what we do and did is to propose a very clear timeline for mandatory deployment of recharging stations, for example, across the core corridors of the EU. Now it's up to the Parliament and member states to decide if that roadmap is ambitious enough or if it needs fine-tuning. Some say we don't need all these things, we need more flexibility. But we care to underline that without infrastructure deployment, the car manufacturers will not be able to maintain their ambitious levels of producing e-vehicles. So financing is there. The targets, the mandatory targets for infrastructure are there. And this, if deployed, will create the market support or the infrastructure support for the car manufacturers to drive onwards. So I guess...
Could I interrupt you, Philip? Is it also
yes.
part, you mentioned in your opening remarks, forgive me for interrupting you, this contingency, it may be early days, you talked about a contingency plan for the transport sector. Is that part of that debate as well?
The contingency plan is, as I said, it's a plan to make sure that regulatory intervention can be put forward immediately as disruptions occur. Long-term investments and long-term deployment plans are, of course, also affected by crisis, but I don't think it's up for a contingency plan to modulate investment levels during a crisis.
Okay, all right. Anybody else like to respond to that last question before I move on? Okay. Any more questions in the audience? I have a question online. You, madam, yes, please. Yes, God, I just about saw you in time.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hi, Sarah Walker from the European Climate Foundation, and I think I'm the first woman to speak today at
Yeah.
11:35. So I hope we can do a bit better throughout the rest of the conference. There was quite a lot of comments there on the need for cooperation between different sectors. So I wanted to just drill down more about how much cooperation is going on between the transport section of the Commission and others, including energy and trade, because it seems like that would be a better way to get to the root of some of the permitting issues. And I also wanted to highlight, I think, Philippe from Commissioner Valian's cabinet, you talked at the beginning about the need for more sustainable fuels and a basket of measures going towards net zero. But in your basket of measures, you referenced gas and LNG, even as a solution to help us avoid problems arising from Russia stopping gas. So I just wanted to understand more kind of what the Valian cabinet actually considers zero emission. Because it's the European Climate Foundation, I think gas and LNG is very much not on our zero emission list. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Sarah. As you know, Sarah, we can see that the room is full of women, but I have zero power over how to make them ask questions. Unfortunately, I'd like to have that power. Anybody respond? Sarah made a very good point, basically about joined-up policy making, right? Making sure the different parts of the Commission actually talk to each other, which Patrick kind of hinted at in his opening remarks. Philip, I think it's back to you. I mean, do you take Sarah's fundamental point that, or maybe challenge it, that different parts of the Commission need to raise their game in terms of coordinated thinking on this, or is that an unfair comment that Sarah's making, Sarah? How do you respond?
I would say we're quite coordinated. And to respond to the gas and LNG question, let's face it. The first hydrogen plane will come in 2035 or 40. It will be only for short haul distances. There's nothing coming for long haul distances in aviation. So blending of alternative clean fuels is the only solution to decarbonize aviation. And our proposals scale up the blending up to 2050, where we get to about 80%, to be continued beyond. In maritime, switching now from heavy fuel oil to LNG would reduce emissions by double-digit percentage points. It's the same question for coal, because we were speaking about the decisions that we're taking regarding transporting COP. The same COP could not issue a statement to phase out coal. So I believe that in energy, we need to stop coal now, and we need to substitute it immediately with something else, which is gas, because renewables are intermittent, and we should stop Russian gas now in order to stop financing a war that's killing women and children. So it's quite clear we need gas, biogas, hydrogen in the future, and that's the way to go. And it will become carbon neutral by 2050. But if we want to reduce emissions now, we have to take actions now. And in some transport modes, there is no electric action possible now, like maritime and aviation. I think everybody can agree to that as well.
Thank you. If there are no more questions in the room, I have one last question online that we have to conclude because the coffee break beckons. It's a question from Takis Lefkaritis, who's the general manager of Petrolina Electric Limited. And I'll read this as clearly and as slowly as I need to. For EU countries to reach their environmental targets, we are dependent on the supply chain of technologies such as PV. The price and availability of PV is now outside the control of the EU as we host very limited production. It is very naive, says Takis, to believe that China will continue to supply PV that offers a levelized cost of energy at 0.03 euro per kilowatt. With the current prices of electricity, how can we plan around this supply chain issue? pretty specific question, but any on the panel want to attempt to respond to Takis before we conclude? We haven't mentioned China the last hour and a quarter, so it's a good time to talk about China briefly. Anybody want to respond, or has Takis stunned you all into silence? Takis, I'm sorry, Takis, you have stunned the panel into silence. So maybe you can take the discussion offline, and we can give you the email addresses if they agree of the panel. Maybe they can respond to you if they so choose via email. It is now exactly 11:35, and the program says that we break here for coffee. I'd like to, before we do that, thank my panel. It's not easy to be on a panel and certainly to moderate a panel which is hybrid, virtual and physical. I think we just about pulled it off, David, you and I here. And thank you to Philip, to Patrick, to Peter, and to you, Sir Patrick, David, for being with me and with this morning. And let's have a coffee break and come back in about 20 minutes or so. Thank you very much.